The lioness's teeth closed around Kyle Mofokeng's forearm, and he felt the canines punch through his canvas sleeve like two hot nails driven into wet wood. His knees hit the dirt, his free hand slammed flat against the cracked earth, and for one full second he was face to face with 400 pounds of mother cat, her breath hitting him like rotten meat in a furnace. What happened in the next 72 hours would become Kruger's Northern Corridor legend, a story whispered about for decades by rangers on night patrol, veterinary crews flying in from Johannesburg, and old Shangaan trackers who swore they'd never seen anything like it in 50 years of walking the bush. But let me back up. Not far, just enough. Kyle was 31, ex-military medic turned senior field ranger for the Makuleke concession, 12 years walking the sand roads where the Limpopo bends north. He knew lions. He darted them, collared them, pulled snares off their legs in the dark. He was not the kind of man who froze. But that morning, when the radio call came in from the Pafuri patrol post, lone lioness, injured, refusing to move from the dry riverbed, something about the coordinates made his jaw clench. That riverbed was where the Nwanedi drainage narrowed into a choke point. Poachers used it. Hyena clans owned it after dark. Nothing good stayed there long. He drove the land cruiser as far as the sand allowed, then went on foot. Alone. His backup ranger, a kid named Sifo, was 40 minutes south dealing with a snare line. Kyle carried a dart rifle, a medkit the size of a suitcase, and a machete he'd owned since the army. The bush was thick, mopane scrub pressing in on both sides, and the November heat was already brutal by 7 in the morning. He followed drag marks in the sand. Fresh, wide. Something heavy had pulled itself through here. He found her in a shallow depression under an overhanging bank. The lioness. She was lying on her side, ribs heaving, her hind left leg twisted at a bad angle, the kind of angle that means the bone isn't where it's supposed to be. A cable snare, the cheap kind poachers build from stolen fence wire, was buried so deep into her thigh that the flesh had swollen around it in a ridge of infected tissue. She'd been caught, she'd fought, she'd dragged herself free, and the wire had come with her. It was still attached, 3 meters of cable trailing behind her like a steel tail. Believe me, he should have waited for backup. Protocol said wait. Every manual, every training session, every dead ranger's memorial plaque on the wall at Skukuza said wait. But when he stepped closer and she didn't charge, didn't even lift her head, he knew she was out of fight. And then he saw it. Behind her, pressed against her belly, were 2 cubs. Tiny, maybe 3 weeks old. Eyes barely open, fur still downy, bodies no bigger than house cats. One was nursing weakly, the other wasn't moving. That changed everything. A lone injured lioness was a problem. A lone injured lioness with newborn cubs in a poacher-active drainage was a death sentence, for her and for them. Kyle keyed his radio. Pafuri base, this is Mofokeng. I've got a snared lioness, Nwanedi choke point, 2 cubs, one possibly dead. I need a vet and I need Sifo. Fast, static, then a voice, copy Kyle. Vet is in Falaborwa, 3 hours minimum. Sifo en route 3 hours. In 3 hours the hyenas would find the blood trail. In 3 hours the sun would turn this depression into an oven. In 3 hours that infected leg could go septic and shut down her organs. He set down the medkit and made a choice. Here's what nobody tells you about approaching a downed lioness. She might look finished. She might look like she can't move. But a lion's front end operates on a completely different power grid than the back. Those forelegs, those jaws, they work fine even when the rest of the body is wrecked. He learned that lesson with his forearm. He'd knelt to examine the trailing snare cable, moved too close to her head, and she'd struck. Not a full attack, just a grab, a warning, a mother saying, "Get away from my babies," with the only language she had left. He didn't scream. He didn't pull. Pulling against a lion's bite is how you lose the arm. He went still, locked eyes with her, and spoke in a low, steady Songa murmur, the kind of voice old cattle herders use with spooked bulls. Kena, it's me. I'm not here for them. 5 seconds, 10. The pressure on his arm was immense. He could feel the bones flexing, but she hadn't closed all the way. She was holding him, not crushing him. Then she let go. Blood ran down his fingers and dripped into the sand. He wrapped it fast with gauze from his kit, one-handed, teeth tearing the tape. His hands were steady. That surprised him. The steadiness would not last. Now he had a decision tree with no good branches. He couldn't dart her. A tranquilizer dose strong enough for an adult lioness could seep through her milk and kill the cubs. He couldn't leave to get help. The hyenas. He couldn't treat the snare wound without getting closer than she wanted him. So he did the one thing that wasn't in any manual. He sat down, 4 meters away, in the open, and he waited. I swear this happened. For 90 minutes, Kyle Mofokeng sat in the sand in the 180 drainage with a bleeding arm and watched a dying lioness watch him. The sun climbed. The heat bent the air. Flies found the blood on his gauze and the infection on her leg. Neither of them moved. But something shifted. Call it exhaustion, call it recognition, call it whatever you want. She stopped tracking him with her eyes. She let her head drop, her breathing slowed, and the nursing cub detached and rolled away from her belly, mewling. That's when he moved, slowly, on his knees. He reached the cub first, the one that hadn't been moving. He touched its side, cold, stiff, gone. Maybe dead before he'd arrived, maybe dead overnight. He didn't linger on it. He picked up the living cub, which screamed, a thin, reedy sound like a broken whistle, and the lioness's head came up. Her eyes locked on him, every muscle in her neck tightened, but she didn't strike. She watched him hold her cub, and she stayed down. Get this, that dead cub wasn't killed by the snare. When Kyle turned the small body over, he saw the discoloration around the mouth, dark gums, foam residue, poison, temic, a banned pesticide that poaching syndicates mix into carcasses to kill vultures, because vultures circle kills and alert rangers. The lioness had fed on a poisoned carcass. The toxin passed through her milk. One cub absorbed enough to die. The other, smaller, had nursed less. It was alive, but on borrowed time. And the mother herself was carrying the poison in her system, weakening her on top of the snare injury. One dead cub, one barely alive. A mother full of pesticide with a cable eating into her femoral artery, and the nearest vet was still 2 hours out. Kale made his second impossible call. He opened the med kit. He didn't have lion-specific drugs. He had what a field medic carries: activated charcoal, saline, oral rehydration solution, basic antibiotics, and a pair of long-nosed wire cutters he'd thrown in that morning on instinct. He mixed activated charcoal into a saline slurry, loaded it into a syringe, and crawled, on his belly, arm throbbing, blood soaking through the gauze, toward the lioness. She growled, low, continuous. The sound vibrated in his chest cavity. He kept crawling. He got within arm's reach. He could see the snare wire disappearing into the swollen flesh, could see the individual flies landing on the wound, could smell the infection. Sweet, wrong, like fruit rotting in a closed room. He reached out with a syringe and pressed the charcoal slurry against the corner of her mouth. She snapped at it. The syringe went flying. Charcoal splattered across the sand. Trust me on this. He loaded a second syringe, crawled back. She snapped again, but this time her jaw caught the barrel of the syringe and he depressed the plunger as she bit down. Half the charcoal went into her mouth, half into the dirt. It wasn't enough. It was something. He backed away, breathing hard, and that's when his hands started shaking. Not before. Not when she bit his arm. Not when he found the dead cub. Now. After the competent act, after the careful crawl, his body decided to inform him that he was terrified. His fingers trembled so badly he couldn't recap the syringe. He sat in the sand and pressed his palms flat against his thighs and breathed through his nose until the shaking slowed enough to function. Then the hyenas arrived. 3 of them. Coming up the drainage from the east, following the blood trail the way hyenas always do, patient, unhurried, grinning those permanent grins. They weren't big. Clan scouts probably, testing the situation before calling in reinforcements. But 3 hyenas against a crippled lioness and newborn cubs wasn't a fight. It was a meal ticket. Kyle stood up, full height. He grabbed the machete in his good hand and walked toward them. Not running, walking. He yelled, a raw, throat-tearing sound, not words, just noise. He banged the machete against the medkit case, metal on metal, clanging across the riverbed. 2 hyenas peeled off and melted into the scrub. The third held its ground, looked at the lioness, looked at Kyle, and made a calculation. It circled right. Kyle moved to cut it off. It feinted left. He swung the machete and missed. And behind him, the lioness did something nobody would have believed if he hadn't later found the paw prints. She stood up, on 3 legs, dragging the snared forth 400 pounds of poisoned, injured, half-dead mother lion, hauled herself upright and roared. Not loud, not long, a broken, wet, shredding sound like canvas tearing. But it was enough. The hyena bolted. The scrub swallowed it. The drainage went quiet. The lioness collapsed. Her body hit the sand and didn't move. Kyle ran to her. She was breathing barely, her ribs jerking in shallow, irregular spasms. She'd spent everything she had left to back him up. He'd saved her from the approach. She'd saved him from the flank. First cycle, life for life. And now they were both worse off than before. Here's the thing about the bush. It doesn't care about your courage. The sun kept climbing. By 11, the sand was hot enough to blister skin. The living cub, tucked into Kyle's shirt against his chest, was overheating. He could feel its tiny heartbeat going too fast, its breathing turning rapid and shallow. Dehydration, toxin exposure, heat, pick your killer. They were all lining up. He built shade, dragged mopane branches, stacked them over the lioness and himself, created a rough lean-to against the overhanging bank. It dropped the temperature maybe 5 degrees. Not enough. He soaked a rag in saline and squeezed drops into the cub's mouth. It swallowed. He soaked another rag and laid it across the lioness's flank. She flinched, then settled. His radio crackled. Kyle, Sifo, I'm 20 minutes out. The vet's chopper is airborne from Phalaborwa. ETA 90 minutes. How bad? Bad. 1 cub dead, toxin exposure. Mother snared, compound fracture left hind, probable sepsis. I've given charcoal. The wire is deep, Sifo. I'm going to try to cut it. Silence. Then, don't. Wait for the vet. In 90 minutes, she'll be dead. The wire's on the femoral. I can see the pulse in the swelling. If it cuts through, she bleeds out in minutes. I'm going in. No, that wasn't in the protocol either. He took the wire cutters. He took a deep breath. He crawled to her hind leg. The snare was a single loop of braided steel cable, maybe 4 millimeters thick, cinched tight enough that the flesh had mushroomed around it. The trick was cutting the cable without nicking the artery underneath. He could see the artery pulsing through the translucent stretched skin. 1 slip, that's all it would take. He positioned the cutters. His bad arm screamed. The bite wound had stiffened. The gauze was brown with dried blood, and gripping the cutter handles sent fire from his wrist to his shoulder. He squeezed. The cable was tough. The cutters bit into the first braid and held. He squeezed harder. Sweat ran into his eyes. The lioness's leg twitched. He froze. She settled. He squeezed again. The cable snapped. The release of tension was instant. The wire sprang open. The swollen flesh decompressed, and a surge of dark, foul-smelling fluid burst from the wound, infection draining. The lioness jerked, her whole body convulsing, and her hind leg kicked out and caught Kale in the chest. He went backwards, landed flat, the wind knocked out of him, the cub in his shirt wailing. For 10 seconds he couldn't breathe. Then air came back in a ragged gasp, and he rolled onto his side and checked the cub, alive, squirming, angry. He looked at the lioness. The wound was open now, draining freely, and the leg was straightening as the compressed tissue expanded. She was panting, tongue out, eyes half closed. But the bleeding was venous, not arterial. Dark, slow, manageable. He'd missed the femoral, by millimeters maybe, but he'd missed it. Now you'd think that's the relief. That's the breath. And it was for about 45 seconds. Then Kyle heard an engine. Not Sifo's Land Cruiser. Sifo drove a diesel, a deep rumble you could identify a kilometer away. This was a petrol engine, lighter, higher pitched, and it was coming from the wrong direction, north, from across the border area where vehicles had no business being. He grabbed his binoculars and glassed the ridge above the drainage, a white Toyota Hilux with no plates, 2 men in the cab, a third in the bed with something long across his lap. Could have been a rifle, could have been a snare pole. Either way, they weren't rangers, they weren't tourists, and they were heading straight for the drainage. This is where it gets real. Kyle had no weapon except the machete and the dart rifle, which was loaded with a tranquilizer dose that would put a human into respiratory arrest. He had an injured lioness, a dying cub, and 1 working arm. The Hilux stopped on the ridge. The men got out. 1 pointed toward the riverbed. They'd seen the Land Cruiser. Kyle keyed his radio, low. "Sifo, I've got a vehicle, North Ridge, 3 males, possibly armed. I need you here now. And call Pafuri anti-poaching. Copy, 12 minutes. 12 minutes is a long time when you're alone in a ditch." The men started down the slope. Kyle did the only thing that made tactical sense. He stood in the open, in his ranger uniform, with the dart rifle visible across his chest, and he waited. Rangers in Kruger have been killed for less. He knew that. Every ranger knows that. But poachers calculate risk, and a uniformed ranger with a rifle, even a dart rifle, changes the math. Especially when they don't know he's alone. Especially when they can't tell it's not a real gun from 200 meters. They stopped. The one from the truck bed raised his hand to shade his eyes. Kyle didn't move, didn't wave, didn't shout, just stood there, feet planted, rifle across his body, blood on his arm, looking exactly like a man who had backup coming. The 3 men looked at each other. Then they turned, walked back up the slope, got in the Hilux. The engine started. The truck reversed along the ridge and disappeared north. Kyle's knees buckled. He sat down hard. The cub in his shirt mewed. You know what, that moment right there, that's the one that haunts people in this line of work. Not the teeth, not the wire, not the hyenas. The humans. The ones who lay the snares, who poison the carcasses, who shoot rangers for being in the way. The dead cub in the sand behind him was their handiwork. Temik in a zebra carcass, meant to wipe out a vulture colony so poaching kills go undetected, and instead it killed a 3-week-old lion cub that never even opened its eyes all the way. One line, woven into the action. That's the bigger picture. That's why this matters beyond one lioness in one drainage. Sifo arrived 11 minutes later, skidding the diesel into the riverbed with a cloud of dust that made the lioness growl weakly. He was 23, lean, fast, and he took one look at Kyle's arm, the lioness, the dead cub, and the living cub pressed against Kyle's chest, and he went quiet, just for a moment. Then he moved. Together they stabilized the scene. Sifo set up a drip stand, a mopane branch jammed into the sand, and ran saline into a line that Kyle placed in the lioness's foreleg vein, a trick he'd learned from the vet on a previous call. The lioness didn't fight it. She was too far gone. They packed the snare wound with antibiotic ointment and wrapped it with gauze and duct tape, the bush surgeon's best friend. They shaded the area better, rigging a tarp from the Land Cruiser over the depression. The cub drank more saline from the soaked rag. Its heartbeat steadied, but it wasn't out of danger. Without mother's milk, clean milk, not the poison-laced supply, it would starve within days. And even if the lioness survived, her milk might stay toxic for weeks. The vet chopper came in at 1:15. Dr. Anel Botha, a woman who'd been treating wildlife in the Lowveld for 20 years, short gray hair, hands like a pianist, voice like a drill sergeant. She jumped from the helicopter before the blade stopped turning, took one look at Kyle's arm and said, "You're an idiot." I know, that was not a question. "Sit down. Show me the cat." She examined the lioness, checked vitals, drew blood, and confirmed what Kyle suspected. Organophosphate poisoning. Sublethal in her, lethal in the dead cub. The live one needs formula and activated charcoal, and we need to flush the mother's system before her liver gives out. She darted the lioness with a carefully calculated sedative, light, fast-acting, safe for a lactating female, and went to work on the leg. The fracture was a green stick, not a full break. The bone was cracked, not separated. Dr. Botha set it with a splint improvised from the medkit's rigid case, wrapped it, injected long-acting antibiotics and an organophosphate antidote directly into the muscle. The whole procedure took 40 minutes. Kyle held the lioness's head the entire time, his injured arm braced against her mane, his good hand resting on the bridge of her nose. She breathed. He breathed. Their rhythms synced up in a way that Sifo later said was the strangest thing he'd ever witnessed. And here's the moment I need you to picture. Kyle is kneeling in the sand, exhausted, bitten, sunburned, holding the head of a wild lioness while a vet reconstructs her leg and a 3-week-old cub sleeps inside his shirt against his bare skin. He hasn't eaten. He hasn't slept. He's been running on adrenaline and stubbornness for 6 hours, and when Dr. Botha says she might make it, his jaw clenches, his eyes fill, and a single tear cuts a line through the dust on his face. He doesn't wipe it. He doesn't look away from the lioness, he just lets it fall. That's the second cycle. Not life for life this time. Shared vulnerability, both of them broken, both of them still breathing, both refusing to quit. She'd stood up on 3 legs to roar for him. He'd crawled through the sand to cut the wire for her, and now they were both lying in the dirt, trusting each other with what they had left. Dr. Botha airlifted the dead cub for necropsy, evidence for the anti-poaching unit, proof of temic contamination that would later lead to the arrest of a 3-man syndicate operating out of a village north of the park. That small, stiff body became Exhibit A in a case that shut down a poisoning ring responsible for killing over 200 vultures and an unknown number of predators across the Limpopo province. The cub that died in the dark did something in death that it never got to do in life. It mattered, but the living cub needed a mother. Here's what they did. Dr. Botha flushed the lioness's system with 4 fluids and antidote for the rest of the afternoon. Kyle bottle-fed the cub with a formula mix Dr. Botha carried in her kit, a blend designed for large felids, warmed in a tin cup over a gas burner. The cub latched onto the rubber nipple and drank like it was the first good thing that had ever happened. Kyle held it in his palm, this creature that would one day weigh 300 pounds, and felt it purr, not a house cat purr, a vibration like a small engine, deep and mechanical and completely trusting. By sunset, the lioness was awake. The sedative had worn off, the splint was holding, the swelling in her leg had reduced dramatically, and she was hungry, a sign that the antidote was working, that her body was fighting back. Sifo had hauled an impala carcass from the patrol post's cold store, and when they dragged it near the depression, the lioness pulled herself forward and fed. Kyle placed the cub beside her while she ate. The cub crawled to her belly, found a teat, latched on, and the lioness paused, looked down at it, and licked its head, one long, slow stroke of the tongue that flattened its ears and made it squeak. Dr. Botha tested the milk an hour later. Toxin levels were dropping. Not 0, but falling fast. "She'll be clean by morning," she said. "The cub's getting more charcoal and formula tonight, but by tomorrow it can nurse safely." They camped in the drainage that night, all of them. Sifo slept in the Land Cruiser with the radio on. Dr. Botha dozed in a camp chair with the dart rifle across her knees. Kyle didn't sleep. He sat by the depression 5 meters from the lioness and kept watch. Hyenas called in the darkness. A leopard coughed from the ridge. The stars were so thick they looked like spilled salt on black cloth. At 2 in the morning, the lioness stood up, on 4 legs this time. She was shaking, unsteady, but upright. She walked, limped, really, to the edge of the depression, looked out into the darkness, and turned back. She looked at Kyle, not the way she'd looked at him that morning, when he was a threat, when he was something to bite and warn away. This was different. This was recognition. This was the look of an animal that understood, in whatever way an animal understands, that the creature sitting in the sand had spent a day keeping her alive. Morning came. The cub nursed. The milk was clean. Dr. Botha ran a final blood panel from a dart-administered draw and declared the lioness stable enough to move on her own. The splint would hold for weeks, long enough for the greenstick fracture to set. The snare wound was ugly but draining clean. She'd limp for months. She might always limp, but she'd live. Now came the hardest part, letting go. Kyle removed the tarp, cleared the branches, opened the depression to the riverbed. The lioness could leave whenever she chose. The question was whether she would take the cub, whether her maternal instinct was intact after everything. The poison, the pain, the humans. She stood, picked the cub up in her jaws, the way lionesses do, by the scruff, gentle as a surgeon. The cub hung limp and trusting. She walked to the edge of the depression and stopped. Kyle was standing 10 meters away. She turned her head and looked at him, not the bite warning look, not the exhausted look, something new. She held his gaze for 5 full seconds. Sifo counted, he told me later, and then she did something that Kyle said he would remember until the day he died. She lowered her head. Not a bow, not a nod, nothing anthropomorphic. A dip of the skull, a relaxation of the neck, the gesture a lioness makes when she accepts a Pride member's presence. Submission isn't the right word. Acknowledgement. You are not a threat, you are known. Kyle's throat tightened. His bitten arm hung at his side. His whole body was a map of the last 30 hours: dust, blood, sweat, charcoal stains, thorn scratches. He raised his good hand, palm out, fingers open, not reaching, just showing her his hand. She looked at it. Then she turned and walked up the drainage, cub in her jaws, bad legs swinging wide with each step but carrying weight, carrying her forward, carrying them both into the Mopane scrub. And then the cub did something. It twisted in her grip, turned its tiny head, and it looked back at Kyle, eyes open, all the way open, maybe for the first time, bright amber in the morning sun, staring at the man who'd held it against his chest through the longest day of its short life. It stared for 3 seconds. Then the brush swallowed them both. Kyle stood there. Sifo stood behind him. Dr. Botha leaned against the chopper. Nobody spoke. The drainage was empty. Just sand, Mopane, and the marks they'd all left. Tire tracks, boot prints, paw prints, drag marks, blood spots turned brown in the sun. Then Kyle said it. 7 words. Quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. She was never mine to keep. Dr. Botha turned away. Sifo wiped his face with his sleeve. Nobody added anything. There was nothing to add. If this story grabbed you, if you felt that cub's heartbeat or that wire snapping or that roar on 3 legs, hit subscribe. Seriously. This channel runs on people who care about stories like this, and there are more coming. Hit the bell too. You won't regret it. Now here's where the story becomes legacy. Kyle tracked her. Not that day, not that week, but over the months that followed. He found her prints along the 180, always heading north, always with the smaller prints beside them. The cub was growing. The lioness's stride was evening out, the limp fading as the bone healed. He never got close again. He didn't need to. The prints were enough. 6 months later, a camera trap on the northern boundary caught a lioness with a deep scar on her left hind leg and a healthy, fat, half-grown cub crossing a waterhole at dusk. The cub was female. The vet team identified the lioness by her scar pattern. She'd joined a small pride, 2 other females and a young male. She was hunting again. The cub was playing with the other juveniles in the frame, batting at a tortoise, tumbling in the dust. Kyle pinned the camera trap photo to the wall above his desk at the Pafuri station. He didn't frame it, just a thumbtack and a glossy print, curling at the edges in the humidity. The Temik case went to court 8 months after the rescue. The 3-man syndicate was convicted. 246 vulture deaths, 14 predator deaths, and 1 lion cub. The evidence chain started with that small, stiff body Dr. Botha airlifted from the drainage. The judge cited it specifically in sentencing. Sifo transferred to the K9 anti-poaching unit the following year. He named his first tracking dog Nwanedi. Dr. Botha published a paper on field treatment of organophosphate poisoning in lactating large felids. It's dry reading, 12 pages of toxicology and dosage charts, but the acknowledgments section has 1 line, to Kyle Mofokeng, who did everything wrong and saved 2 lives. And in the Nwanedi drainage, in that shallow depression under the overhanging bank, the Mopane scrub grew back thicker the following rainy season. The rains were good that year. The river ran for the first time in 3 seasons, clear water over clean sand, and a fish eagle, one of the first seen in that section in years, built a nest in a jackalberry tree 40 meters from where Kyle had sat in the dirt and held a lioness's head while a stranger put her leg back together. The eagle is still there. The camera traps still click. The drainage still smells like dust and Mopane and wild sage after rain. And sometimes, the rangers say, if you walk the sand road at dawn, you can find the prints. 2 sets, 1 large, 1 small, heading north, always north, into the bush, into the life that almost ended in a snare and a cup of poison and the stubbornness of 1 man who sat down in the sand and refused to leave. That's the story. That's all of it. And every word is the kind of true that the bush teaches you. The kind where the facts bend around something bigger. Something you can't weigh or measure or put in a report, but you feel it when you're out there alone and the light is right and the wind drops and the world goes still and you realize you're standing in a place where something extraordinary happened between a human and a lion, and neither of them will ever be the same.